All right. Great. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. I'm Carolina Caballero, and I'm the Associate Director of the Cuban and Caribbean Studies Institute at Tulane University. And I'd like to welcome you all to the first installment of our lunchtime speaker series on contemporary Cuba. This series and our invited speakers were inspired by recent events on the island. Cuba recently initiated an intense economic reform in preparation for and immediately following the eradication of their two-currency system. They have suffered, as many of us know, they have suffered an increasingly tense and hostile relationship with the US under the Trump administration, which culminated with Cuba's return to the list of state sponsors of terrorism just on January 11th, a few short weeks ago. And there have been a number of protests of various groups, among them artists and intellectuals, and an ensuing backlash from official channels. And all of this has been broadcasted internationally through social media and independent news sources. And this movement is known as N27, N27. So we set out to invite Cuba scholars and experts to explain what is going on now and what does it mean for the island and its revolutionary project's future. So thank you so very much for being here. And I'd like to introduce Professor Ludovico Feoli, the Executive Director of CIPER, the Center for Inter-American Policy and Research here at Tulane University, who will introduce today's speaker and moderate the discussion on Cuba's economy. And before I turn the video or the microphone to him, please be advised that this will be recorded. This talk will be recorded to be posted on the Stone Center of Latin American Studies YouTube page at a later date. Thank you very much, and go ahead, Ludovico.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you to the Center for Cuban and Caribbean Studies Center for organizing this very interesting series. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Paolo Spadoni, who is an associate professor in the Department of Social Sciences at Augusta University in Georgia. He is a trilingual political economist with a specialization in international relations and a focus on Latin America's political and business environments. His research focuses on international relations theories, Cuba's economy and business market, foreign investment in Cuba, and US-Cuba relations. Dr. Spadoni also has a comprehensive background in comparative politics, Cuba-European Union relationships, and foreign investment in Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic. He has extensive traveling experience throughout Latin America, something that was unfortunately interrupted as we were discussing before the event this year. But he has been to countries throughout the region, including Cuba, Costa Rica, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil. He's the author of Cuba's Socialist Economy Today, Navigating Challenges and Changes, and of Failed Sanctions, Why the US Embargo Against Cuba Could Never Work. He received his PhD in political science and government from the University of Florida, and most importantly, he was a postdoctoral fellow at CIPER from 2009 to 2010. It's great to welcome you back to Tulane, Paolo, as always, even if virtually. And we hope to have you back in person soon. Just a point of order before I yield the microphone to you. We're going to give our speaker about 30 minutes to make his presentation. I hope you all are able to see his PowerPoint on screen. And then we're going to open it up to some Q&A. I would ask that you request to be acknowledged by raising your digital hand or your actual hand. And we will collect a few questions before passing them over to our speaker. So with no further ado, I'll give it over to you, Paolo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ludovico, and thank you to the organizers of this event. I was looking forward to be in person in New Orleans as I've been in the past, but I'm very excited to kick off this contemporary Cuba speaker series at Tulane University. And I've prepared a presentation, which you can see from the title, The Cuban Economy, Performance, Problems, and Prospects. Needless to say, the Cuban economy as we speak, at the start of 2021, finds itself in very precarious conditions. On the one hand, there are all the problems that are typical of a state-dominated and overly centralized economy like that of Cuba. I'm speaking about low productivity, inefficiency, red tape, distortion of all kinds in the economy. When we talk about the Cuban economy today, we basically talk about a service economy with a weak production base and severe structural weaknesses, which I will cover in a little while. Services right now account for about 80% of Cuba's GDP, generate the vast majority of foreign exchange revenues, and receive the largest share of all investments. So today, the Cuban economy is essentially a service economy. And one thing also that has added more problems to the economy of Cuba is the external environment that has deteriorated quite significantly over the past few years, initially due to the Venezuelan political and economic crisis, then to Trump's punitive measures against Cuba, which began in 2017, and finally to the coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic. What I will do in this presentation, I will start talking about the structural changes the Cuban economy went through since 1990, how we came from an economy based on the production of sugar and other basic products to an economy today that is mostly based on services. Then I will review the recent macroeconomic performance of the economy, mostly focusing on GDP growth, trade patterns, both merchandise and service, agricultural and industrial production. I will talk briefly about the external debt and the overall financial situation of the country. Then I will review the systemic problems that affect significantly the performance of the economy and the external factors that I already mentioned. And then finally, I will talk briefly about the prospect for the future, the economic reforms that are ongoing right now, and the Biden presidency, which can mean a potential relaxation of sanctions against Cuba, but there are also challenges to be acknowledged. Now, this table kind of exemplify the changes, the structural changes the Cuban economy went through between 1990 and today. As we can see, in 1990, essentially the Cuban economy was based on sugar production. 72.6% of all our currency revenues came from sugar export, and in lower extent, nickel and other few products. If we move forward another decade or so, by 2004, tourism was the most important generator of our currency for Cuba. And then if we move another 15 years ahead, we can see how the category of other services, over 60%, those are the services that are professional services provided by Cuban doctors abroad and also by other professionals. They are the most important source of our currency for Cuba today. So 1990, tourism replaced sugar as country's greatest source of foreign exchange, and then post-2004. And why 2004? Because that's the time that the ties between Cuba and Venezuela became stronger and stronger. So during the Chavez presidency, that's when the export of professional services became the most important source of our currency for Cuba. So here you have a snapshot of the main sources of our currency. Number one, exports of professional services, in particular medical. Today we are talking in the range of 6 billion, possibly more in 2019, even though that number has been declining. One thing that we have to recognize is that those funds are not really funds that create liquidity. They're mostly committed to the purchase of goods from Venezuela and other countries. So even today, Cuba must rely primarily on revenues from tourism, remittances from abroad, and exports of key goods to build foreign exchange and reserves. When it comes to international tourism, it was already declining in 2019, so there was already a drop in the number of arrivals and in the number of, in the revenues that generate the sector. Then, of course, 2020 became much worse. Canada, the United States, and the countries of the European Union are the main sources of tourists to Cuba. Remittances until 2019 were estimated at 3.7 billion a year, and there's also a huge amount of in-kind remittances, people traveling to Cuba and bringing products to their families, or for products that are being used to build a business and for other purposes. And finally, exports of nickel, sugar, pharmaceutical, and tobacco, which are the most important export products for Cuba, only about 1.3 billion combined revenues in 2019. If we compare those revenues to the one coming from tourism, professional services, remittances, definitely the export sector of Cuba today in terms of goods does not provide enough revenues. Here we have a a figure on the real GDP growth between 2004 and 2020. Initially, the 2005 and 2007 expansion was mainly fueled by exports of professional services under a special agreement with Venezuela. Then after 2017, there was a strong deceleration. For the very first time in 2019, the Cuban economy contracted, a small contraction of minus 0.2%. It was the very first contraction since 1993. And then the preliminary figures for 2020 is a contraction of 11% of the GDP, which, by the way, is worse than the Latin American average, which would be 7.7%. So Cuba actually performed worse than the average Latin American country. Now, when we put together the figures on external trade in goods and services, we can see how the Cuban economy has been recording surpluses in the overall trade balance. But when it comes to merchandise exports, Cuba is a country that has a significant amount of imports, way more than it should have. It's importing fuels, foodstuffs, machinery, manufactured goods. We're talking only of fuels, or a significant amount every year, 2 billion in food and so forth. So the Cuban economy definitely is an economy that is supposed to export more and to import less, but so far the import substitution programs that have been put in place by the Cuban government have not been giving the results they expected. So we can see here in 2020, by the way, both export and imports overall of goods and services were down, even though a surplus most likely was recorded in 2020 as well, only because they've been importing less. Cuba has announced a drastic cut in imports in 2020, over 30%. And of course, that means also a lack of availability of products for the population. For the very first time in 2018, the Cuban government reported official numbers on exports of services. Until then, that's why the category in the previous figures was about other services, was never provided a breakdown of what those services were. So 2018 and 2019, we can see where the services revenues come from. For the most part, number one, healthcare. Those are the services provided by medical professionals, doctors and nurses abroad. Not only in Venezuela, but in many other countries. Cuba has had medical missions throughout Latin America for many years, but definitely over the past few years, they've been providing medical services for cash, not only to Venezuela, but to other countries as well. So healthcare is definitely the most important source of foreign exchange for Cuba. Then there are other categories that are less, let's say, clear. The support services category is not very clear what this refers to, but it has to do some services related to healthcare in other areas that also generate our currency revenues for Cuba. So once we take a look at this figure, definitely there's little doubt the professional and especially medical services are today the biggest export earner for Cuba. Now, what are the principal challenges at the moment? When it comes to trade, significant. Number one, large merchandise trade deficit. As I said before, Cuba imports way more than it should. Excessive trade concentration, both in terms of products and markets. There are only a few export markets and only a few export products. Vulnerability to international price swings. When it comes to nickel prices, oil prices, sugar prices, Cuba is very vulnerable to changes in the prices of those products on the international market. And then finally, over-reliance on activities with low cross-sector multiplier effects. What I mean by that, when it comes to export of professional services, there are not many cross-sector spillovers to other sectors of the economy, except some ties to the biotech industry. Even the nickel that Cuba exports is extracted in Cuba and is refined abroad, so it does not have many multiplier effects on the rest of the economy, as opposed to sugar and tourism, which is, instead they do have those effects, but they have not performed as good as they should, especially sugar. Cuba has very depressed agricultural and industrial production. I will show it in a moment. A sizable foreign debt in our currency, despite the fact that Cuba has been given significant debt renegotiations and debt relief over the past few years. Structural or systemic problems. Cuba has been promoted non-state activities, cooperatives and self-entrepreneurs, however, only to a minor extent. So for the most part, the Cuban economy remains a state-dominated economy. And even when it comes to foreign direct investment, there needs to be a change of mentality due to the fact that foreign investment has been promoted, but so far has not played the role in the economy that sometimes even the official declaration would like us to believe. And finally, the worsening external environment that I mentioned before. Here is a table that shows how Cuba traditionally has been trading with just a few countries, has always had one country that stood up as the most important business partner. Until 1990, it used to be the Soviet Union. That's why 1990, 67.9% was Russia, even though at that time Russia was still the Soviet Union. If we move forward, 1990 to 2019, we can see how Venezuela has become more and more important as the main trading partner for Cuba, even though there have been a few years, especially 2016, but in general, between 2014 and 2018, when China, the trade with China had been increasing and become a very important trading partner. So I would say today, Venezuela and to a lower extent, China are the most important trading partners for Cuba, but at very lower levels of trade than they used to be just a few years ago. Now, this figure is on total agricultural production. Now, I'm not providing a breakdown of different kind of products, but I think it's indicative of how the agricultural sector of Cuba has been underperforming even after Raúl Castro, when he became president in 2016, declared that agriculture was a priority. There has been a reorganization of Cuban agriculture, of the sector in general. There have been a land usufruct program. There have been microcredits. There have been some important changes, and yet production has been lagging and remained depressed. And I think it's indicative of the fact that in 2019, the total agricultural production of Cuba was 36% less than it was in 2004 before the reform took off. So I think it's a figure that I wanted to show just to demonstrate how the agricultural sector of Cuba has been underperforming. And generally, agriculture has been an Achilles heel of all socialist economies, and Cuba is no different. Now, Cuba today imports between 60 and 70% of the food it consumes. This is something for an agricultural-based country with lots of land, definitely is a very worrisome indicator. In the agricultural sector, there are private farmers, there are cooperatives, they are definitely more productive and efficient than the state sector, but even so, there are so many problems when it comes to the agricultural cycle, coming from the producer to the consumer, in terms of distribution, in terms of administrative hurdles and so forth, that at the end, there's a lot of problems in terms of production and efficiency, even if the land has been given, for the most part, to private farmers and cooperatives. Now, another very emblematic figure is the index of industrial output. This is an index that spanned 30 years, and I think it's very indicative of the fact that how underperforming also the manufacturing industry of Cuba has been. If we exclude sugar, we can see that in 2019, still Cuba did not produce what it produced in 1989. The index was actually only 72% of the level of 1989. When it comes to consumer goods, roughly was the same level of 30 years before. Machinery and equipment has practically disappeared, and intermediate goods were only 1/3 on what they used to be 30 years later. This, for a country that is trying to produce more, to develop a manufacturing industry, is not a very good figure to show. Now, finally, on the macroeconomic environment, the external debt, sizable external debt, despite significant debt relief that Cuba has enjoyed over the past few years. The last time the external debt was reported, the official one, was in 2017. It was 17.8 billion. Actually, I didn't put the billion, but that's what 17.8 refers to. And it was up from 11.6 billion in 2008. During the same time, Cuba received major write-offs of its debt, 6 billion by China in 2011, 1.4 billion by Japan in 2012, 500 million by Mexican creditors in 2013, and then two very important agreements. 2014, Russia canceled 90% of Cuba's 35.2 billion, the former debt to the Soviet Union that Cuba never recognized. And then, very important, at the end of 2015, the Paris Club forgave 75% of Cuba's 11.1 billion debt and restructured the rest. Now, the terms were very advantageous for Cuba, but there were stiff penalties for not meeting the debt payments, and Cuba did not meet in 2020 some of its payments. So even with this very generous debt restructuring agreement, Cuba still struggled to pay its debt and to find the right liquidity to jumpstart the economy. One thing that has to be acknowledged when it comes to external debt, Cuba has virtually no access to medium and long-term commercial financing, except from a few friendly countries. It's not a member of the IMF, the World Bank, or other US-led international financial institution. This is very important, not only for the issue of debt, but also for the currency unification process that Cuba is implementing right now. If there's any problem in terms of liquidity and you need to jumpstart the economy and to pump money into the economy, Cuba does not have a lender of last resort that can use to do for that purpose. So Cuba must seek short-term financing with high interest rates. Is considered a very high-risk country. And as I said before, beginning at the end of 2019, but this is a recurrent problem, Cuba missed several payments in arrears with commercial creditors. So the liquidity crunch that Cuba is experiencing right now is not something new. So what are the most important problems of the economy today? Now, number one, weak capacity to generate domestic savings to support investment, which is a key reason why Cuba does need foreign investment to jumpstart the economy, to increase production, to lower efficiency, and so forth. For the most part, most state-run companies have very low productivity and efficiency levels. Relative price distortion stemming from government controls, hampering market mechanisms. And finally, the dual monetary system with multiple exchange rates is just being lifted, but the effects are still being felt. And what are those effects? First of all, it's so difficult and almost impossible until now to Cuba to measure the profitability of enterprises since they've been operating with different currency, different exchange rates. So it's very difficult to know what are the ones that really are profitable as compared to the ones that are losing money. So it does create segmented markets, less linkages between state enterprises and enterprises in general, and finally, less foreign investment coming as a result of that system. So that system definitely had to be lifted. The only problem with the lifting of that system right now is that it comes at a very problematic moment for Cuba. Of course, they feel they had no choice, they had to move forward with that, but definitely consider they don't have a lender of last resort, consider the potential problems with inflation and so forth. This is definitely not the best time to do it, but I guess there was no choice. Now, speaking of weak capital formation, this is gross capital formation over the past 30 years. In 1989, right before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba gross capital formation was 25.6%. This is the number that the Cuban economy needs today in order to spur growth, as they say, between 5 or more of GDP every year. However, Cuba has been nowhere near this level over the past 30 years. The average, as I put it here, is 10.4%. And definitely that means that there are less investment in factories, machinery, tools, and other productive capital goods. So definitely this is something they had to work on, and foreign investment would play a significant role here. Now, why foreign investment has been so important despite the low level compared to other countries in particular? All the industries that have experienced the highest growth since 1990 have had significant presence of foreign investment. Oil, nickel, electricity, tourism, telecom, these are all industries that have experienced significant amounts of foreign investment. Cuba in 2014 passed a new foreign investment law, Law 118, and a few months before it opened the first special economic development zone at the port of Mariel. So between these two laws, Law 113 and Law 118, they were supposed to stimulate more and more investment. The official target had been 2 to 2.5 billion in FDI per year, hoping to achieve annual accumulation rates of 20-25% of GDP and growth rates of more than 5%. Definitely these targets have not been met, and they will not be met unless Cuba finally decide to implement deeper and systemic economic reforms that tackle the most notorious shortcomings of its socialist system. Numbers on foreign direct investment, official numbers are not available. These are numbers that come from the Economist Intelligence Unit. they're not independently verifiable, but even if we assume that those numbers are clear, I mean, refer to the actual amount of capital delivered, they are well below the targets. Between 2014 and 2020, the average of foreign direct investment was roughly 676 million. Cuba said that 180 projects have been approved. They involve 7.4 billion worth of investment, and more investment have been approved and in operation in Mariel. However, these are the value of the deals agreed, not the capital delivered. So the amount reported by the EU is the closest we get to some numbers on the capital delivered, but even those numbers are way lower than the official targets of the government. Now, when it comes to the external factors, because the internal factors are so important for the underperformance of the economy, but external factors are important as well. Cuba received what I like to call a triple punch over the past few years. Three main external factors together affecting significantly and potentially devastating the Cuban economy. Number one, the Venezuelan crisis, which, by the way, is not something recent. Since Nicolás Maduro assumed the presidency in 2013, after the passing of Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan economy has been in free fall. Right now, of course, is the worst time, but there have been already several years of declining economy. And of course, with the declining economy, declining oil export and so forth, the close ties that that Chavez had established with Cuba were almost impossible to maintain. As a matter of fact, Venezuela at some point in the early 2010s was involved in several investment projects in Cuba. Many of them never passed the drawing board. They signed the agreement, but they never put it into practice. Even at the refinery of Cienfuegos, which was opened in 2007, by a few years ago, reverted the property back to Cuba, and Venezuela left that particular business. So definitely there's not much going on in terms of Venezuelan investment in Cuba at the moment. Number two of the triple punch is Trump and its punitive economic sanctions against Cuba. Trump started slow. The first measures, as I will show in a moment, were announced in June of 2017, but beginning in November, he incremented. The measures were moving more and more toward more and more restrictions on Cuba, and definitely became very important, to the point that the promise that Trump made at the beginning to undo most of what Obama did, as a matter of fact, it came true. And finally, the coronavirus pandemic that hit Cuba in the early 2020, definitely that added another burden on the economy, which definitely didn't need. So the Venezuelan crisis, as I mentioned before, since Maduro came to power in 2013, it was almost impossible to maintain the close economic ties that Chavez had built with Cuba. Oil shipments to Cuba have been declining, even though sometimes there are some periods where Cuba does receive oil, and of course they go up, they increase. But overall, the oil shipments have been quite unreliable. In part, also because the United States, the Trump administration, imposed sanctions on PDVSA, the oil industry of Venezuela, and on tankers in particular transporting Venezuelan oil to Cuba, making it more difficult for Cuba to receive oil from Venezuela. The export of professional services to Venezuela, Cuban professional services, has been declining. Bilateral and overall trade, as I will show in my next slide, also has been declining. Now, that created significant economic problems to Cuba. Austerity measures were implemented. Cuba also had to purchase oil from alternative suppliers like Russia and Algeria, and definitely the oil supply became an issue. And as I said before, the lifeline that Venezuela has been providing to Cuba is slowly disappearing as we talk, since Venezuela is on the brink of economic collapse. Here is the trade, Cuba's merchandise trade with Venezuela between 2012, which was the highest time in terms of trade, to 2019. We can see there has been a steady decline, both in exports and imports. One thing that we have to recognize, that almost all of Cuba's trade with Venezuela, both export and imports, are accounted for by fuel. Why? Well, first, because Cuba is receiving shipments of oil from Venezuela, but also because until a couple of years ago, it received oil to be refined in Cienfuegos, and also because the Petro-Caribe alliance that Venezuela put forward with many other Caribbean countries relied on oil that was refined in Cuba and it was exported to those countries, and for the most part was reported as export to Venezuela. So both export and imports based on oil dramatically declined between 2012 and 2019. Bilateral trade was 2 billion, less than 1/4 its level in 2012. There was over 8 billion between export and imports. And the exports were down 90% and the imports were down 70%. This is clear that the relationship with Venezuela has been disappearing. Now, when it comes to Trump and his measures on Cuba, I'm not going to go into all details, but I'm going to point out only the most important one. These are all the measures, 8 sets of amendments to sanctions rules that the Trump administration implemented since November 2017 until January 2021. The most important one in terms of economic impact for Cuba, November 2017, the people-to-people group travel replaced the individual people-to-people group travel that Obama had implemented. Once you can travel to Cuba for people-to-people purposes individually, for the most part, the tourism ban that exists in Cuba was almost disappearing because people could travel for all purposes and pretend to be there for people-to-people, some sort of very non-academic educational purposes. But the group travel was the first step. Then that category was eliminated altogether in 2019, end of the people-to-people travel, and very important, the ban on cruise ships to Cuba, which also put an end to a very growing business that had been since 2016. The other very important measure was the activation of Title III of the Helms-Burton. This is a law that was implemented in 1996, but Title III, which is the one that allow U.S. Citizens and Cubans who became citizens after the expropriation occurred to sue in U.S. courts companies that traffic in expropriated properties in Cuba. That was activated in May 2019. And even though it did not generate successful lawsuits, it did provide the chilling effect on foreign investment in Cuba. So these are the most important measures, even though there were several others. Now, if you travel to Cuba, you can practically go, you cannot stay in any state-owned hotels, which practically they are all of them, but the most important one are those. Now, additional things that Trump did, it did create a list of restricted Cuban entities, so no direct financial transaction with those entities, and the recent additions are quite important. In September 2020, at the list were added Finsimex and American International Services, which are the Cuban companies linked to the military that handle all the remittance business in Cuba. And then in January 2021, the Banco Financiero Internacional. Additional measures implemented by Trump, sanctions on foreign banks, lots of fines for doing business with Cuba. It ordered Marriott to cease the hotel activities in Cuba. Marriott was the first company to administer a hotel in Cuba, the former Hotel Quinta Avenida in Havana. It forced Western Union to end remittance services in November 2020 because it could no longer work with Finsimex and American International Services. And finally, as Carolina mentioned before we started, January 2021, only a few days ago, Cuba was put back on the US list of state sponsors of terrorism. This is important because even if Biden will decide to remove Cuba from the list, it's going to take months before he can do so. And briefly on the economic impact, there have been a major reduction of visitor flows to Cuba as a result of the measures of Trump, less revenues, of course, for the Cuban government, but also less revenues for the private sector that have been growing and profiting from a growing number of Americans going to Cuba. As I said before, the activation of Title III of the Helms-Burton did provide impetus for a number of lawsuits, even though most of them were dismissed, including a very important one in July 2020 against Carnival. But definitely there has been a chilling effect. Some of the potential for investment in Cuba have been either postponing or canceling their agreement, especially when it comes to some basic infrastructure agreements. And finally, the impact of the Trump's measure in the area of remittances. There have been a decline for the most part in 2020. Cuba has had more and more difficult to do transactions with foreign banks since they have been fined repeatedly by the United States, more difficult to obtain external credit, and more difficult to obtain reliable and steady supplies of oils from Venezuela. Here is a figure that just shows how the visitors from the United States to Cuba decline. Now, when it comes to Cuban Americans, because Cuba makes a distinction between those who travel with a US passport and those who travel with a Cuban passport, even though there might be some Cuban Americans traveling with the US passport, those who left Cuba before January 1970. However, this number that we can see, the decline in the US citizens of non-Cuban origin in 2019, actually this decline started even before, if we consider that overnight visitors, those who were traveling to Cuba by air, definitely there was a decline even in 2018. I will show it in my next slide. And as I said, Cuban Americans continue to grow, but they had been growing even before because the restrictions of Cuban Americans were lifted in 2009 by the Obama administration. So what it did in 2014 gradually made it more easy for all Americans to travel to Cuba, but Cuban Americans could already travel there without restrictions since 2009. Here is the figure that I mentioned before. If we take a look at 2018, we can see how the overnight visitors, the one by air, already there was a huge decline in 2018. It didn't show in the total amount of arrivals, just only because cruises were on the rise. A very important thing to point out is that 2019, everything stopped in June. So the number of 2019 definitely would have been way worse in 2020, even without the COVID-19 pandemic that hit Cuba in the early part of the year. So the major drop in the second half of 2019 that would have been carried out to 2020, despite even without the coronavirus pandemic. And speaking of that pandemic, definitely that created an additional burden on the economy. It shut down the tourism industry. That was in early March. And even now, Cuba is requiring more and more tests, more and more restriction, and definitely the tourism industry has not been recovering since. As a matter of fact, Cuba received 4.2 million tourists in 2019. In 2020, government figures, only 1.1 million. So definitely there was already 1 million up to the end of February, and then practically very few visitors beginning November when the Havana airport was reopened. Less informal remittance channel. Not only formal channels through Western Union were affected, but also informal. Less people traveling, less people bringing money to their family in Cuba. More and more food shortages. It did provide an opportunity for Cuba to send its doctor abroad. However, the number of doctors of Cuba had been already declining significantly. Numbers show that it was 50,000 in 2015. It was down to 28,000 in 2020 because many doctors had to leave countries like Bolivia, El Salvador, Ecuador, and especially Brazil, where leftist presidents lost power. And of course, those Cuban agreements were eliminated. And finally, as I said, this entire pandemic and entire impact did have an impact on Cuba's currency revenues. I'm putting this figure just to show how in 2020 estimates show there has been a significant decline of our currency revenues for Cuba, for a country that already was suffering because of liquidity crunch and low amount of revenues. So Cuba's total currency revenues in 2020 were 30% less than in 2019, 4.6 billion less. But if we compare to 2014, half of that, there was half a decline, 50% decline, 9.4 billion less. There is no doubt that the liquidity crunch of 2020 due to the coronavirus pandemic was quite significant for an economy that was already experiencing significant problems. And finally, and here I conclude, what are the prospects for the economy at this moment? Now, the Cuba's initial response to the coronavirus-led crisis was to cut imports. That's why food shortages became more and more evident. Revive the food rationing system that it was already being phased down. So less products were provided to people through the rationing system, but it was revamped, considered a difficult moment. Cuba opened dollar stores. That was actually even before the full impact of COVID to capture our currency. However, you cannot use cash. You need to open a bank account, use a credit card, and those stores, dollar stores that have been popping up in Havana, in other cities of Cuba, do provide badly needed products to Cuba in dollars. And finally, suspending the delayed payments on its foreign debt. As I said before, Cuba was already struggling. They had asked for a moratorium to the Paris Club, but definitely as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, they suspended payments and they had to renegotiate that again. Now, in the midst of all of this, it was announced sweeping economic reforms in July 2020. One thing that I want to point out, that those reforms are nothing new, that had been announced in the past. In 2011, the fifth meeting with the Communist Party of Cuba already had the lineamiento, the guidelines with most of these things, promotion of small and medium-sized private enterprises. Now, the novelty here is that they can form partnership with state and foreign companies and perform import and export operations, even though through state companies. So this is something new that they have accepted, that small and medium-sized private enterprises can do. However, the other measures that had been announced in the past, a wholesale market for Cuban private sector that was announced in 2011. There have been a few trial, but it never really took off. Expansion on non-agricultural cooperatives and self-employment. Now, the novelty here is the negative list. Until now, Cuba had a list of the activities that could be performed legally. Now they have a negative list. So they're saying what you cannot do and all the rest supposedly you can do. So this is something new that let's see how it goes. Greater autonomy to state firms. This is a traditional goal of the Cuban government since the early 60s. So this is nothing new here to give more autonomy in decision-making, reinvert profits and so forth. It will remain to be seen how these measures will be implemented. And finally, and here I conclude, Cuba just launched the monetary and exchange rate unification on January 1st, 2021. It's a very complex process, as I said, coming at a very precarious moment. The CUP, the regular Cuban peso, was devalued from the official 101 rate to 124 to the dollar. The CUC, which is the convertible peso, was gone. So now there's only one currency circulating in Cuba, the regular Cuban peso. Gradual reduction in subsidies to state companies, utilities, basic goods. Very important, price controls and a significant increases in wages and pension to cushion the impact on the population. Even so, already the black market in Cuba is thriving. Already there are significant examples of high inflation, and it's a very important problem that could hurt Cubans in the short and medium terms. And finally, only a few comments on the new Biden administration that just took office a few weeks ago. Restrictions on travel and remittances are likely to be eased. However, Cuba is very low on the priority of the Biden administration. And also we have to consider that the hardline approach that Trump implemented, so many visits in Florida, it did play out well when it comes to the election. Trump carried Florida more easily than it happened for Hillary Clinton that it did in 2016. So definitely that was a sign that hardline approach did work. And finally, well, 2021 might be a better year for Cuba, but it remains to be seen. Only if those reforms are implemented, only if the Biden administration and other restrictions are lifted, it might provoke something like that. Otherwise, it might be even a tougher year than 2020 was. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for that excellent presentation. I will take the privilege of the moderator and pose the first question myself. You alluded in passing to some of the impacts of the reforms, of the recent reforms, particularly the unification of the currency. Is there any information, in light of the negative trends, is there any information available about the social impacts of this situation in Cuba? How is it impacting the population in general? Are there measures of poverty, inequality, or other forms of exclusion that might give us an idea of how the people are writing out the circumstance? And in keeping with my comments at the outset, I will open it up to 2 or 3 questions before passing it over to you, Paolo. If anyone would like to make a question, please raise your digital or human hand, and I will acknowledge you. Carolina.
I think my question mostly is, Paolo, the Cuban government has been threatening to eradicate the double monetary system for years now. At least rumored 5 years ago, they first started talking about it. Well, they've known they've always had to. About 5 years ago, the rumors were circulating along the population about it. Last 3 years or 2 years since I've been going to Cuba, all of our vendors, all the people we work with, did not want CUCs. They wanted dollars. So why now is what I don't understand, why they decided to make January 1st of this year hora cero in these horrible financial straits. What are the potential advantages of doing it now at this moment, as opposed to maybe later to see if things improve, or having done it, I don't know, just what are the advantages of doing it now?
Thank you, Carolina. Next is Moises. You're muted, Moises. Phrase of the year.
Okay. Thanks, Ludovico. Thanks, Paolo. I really enjoyed your presentation. I wanted to ask if you could comment a bit more on the size of the underground economy, because it seems to me that as those numbers are declining across the board, the underground economy must be increasing. So are there any figures, numbers you could share that would be helpful? Thank you.
And the last question we'll take before a second batch is Amalia.
Thank you, Paolo, for that presentation. It was super interesting. In relationship to what Moises was asking and Ludovico, I'm very curious if you, and I don't know, there might not be any figures, right? But when you were talking about agricultural products and Cuba being so dependent on food imports, up to a few years ago, there was a lot of hype among people who study food systems, and they were talking about the example of Cuba. They had like this campesino to campesino program that was supposedly growing all this food using agroecological methods, and they were bringing all this food to the city. And that is like used as a main success story among food studies scholars. But that does go underground, I imagine, a lot. It doesn't go in the paper. So I was wondering if you had any knowledge of what was the situation of these urban networks to bring food into the city that are not related to, I don't know, that come in the numbers. And so also very short, if you could tell us a little bit of what did the Chinese wanted, because you went a lot into what the Venezuelans were giving to the Cubans and what was their exchange, but I would be very curious to know like what kind of trade Cuba engaged with China. Thank you.
Okay, Paolo, over to you.
Okay, there are many questions, and one thing that I want to, unfortunately, tell everybody, I wish there would be more data available from Cuba. They are actually way better than they used to be, but when it comes to data on economic inequality, data, as you were asking about the underground economy, I wish there was something more readily available, but most of the studies have been done by people on the ground, field research, without an actual economic data to support it. When it comes to inequality, those inequalities were already fueled in the 90s. Cuba has been struggling with inequalities in economic terms since it opened to remittances and self-entrepreneurship in the 94, 95. Early on, by the way, there was not even a progressive taxation system in Cuba, which was implemented in 2013. So there was not even a mentality of paying taxes. You had access to our currency, to the visa, and you were doing way better than the other. There was a negative stigma early on, then it became more acceptable. But definitely when it comes to inequalities, I think some of the most important figures, which I didn't show in my presentation, were how the salary today buys way less than it used to buy 30 years ago. So only by that number, pensions and wages, we can see that still today we are way lower than the level it was 30 years ago. So if you work for the state today, you are way worse off than you were 30 years ago. And of course, many Cubans, they do still work for the state. Many, they left their job, but definitely those are all inequalities that have been growing over time. And that's why, going back to the question of why now the currency unification, because there was no other choice available. It was kind of something as unavoidable. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned, worst possible time to do it. As a matter of fact, the Día Cero in the Gazette Oficial of Cuba was October 2013. In October 2013, over 5 years ago, already there was all laid out the passages, the financial institution, what they were supposed to do when the currency unification. They always said it's going to be a January 1st of a year. So no one was thinking, okay, January 1st, 2021, that was in 2013. So in Cuba, what happens is that when they say, well, we're going to do it fast, but that fast in Cuba is very, very slow all the time. So to me, unfortunately, 2013 would have been a much better time to do it than 2021. At this point, there are no other option. one problem is that there are so many companies in Cuba that are underperforming, that are operating with losses. You don't even know what they are. You might be closing industries and companies that instead are profitable just because of their financial books. You cannot really evaluate what are the profits and what are the losses. So definitely this measure of currency unification, because some people only focus on the currency, but above all, the most important is exchange rate unification. That's the most important part of the process, because you could get rid of the COC even before 124, the way you do it right now. Even in the past couple of years already, people were using pesos and paying pesos in COC stores. So that wasn't really the issue. The issue is that companies operating in different sectors with different exchange rates, it did incentivize imports that were artificially cheap, and it did affect export that were considered expensive. Now we have only a unified exchange rate, which is supposed to foment export and to make imports more pricey. And of course, in Cuba, for the most part, it was always cheaper to import products than produce them domestically. That's not very good when you try to build a national industry and to increase production. So why now? Because there was no other option available at the moment. And then on agriculture. Agriculture is, as I said, Achilles heel of all socialist economy. In Cuba, the urban agriculture has been an alternative, and the promotion of cooperatives, the land usufruct, the microcredits, you name it. All those things are very important. The problem is that the agricultural cycle is one. It starts from the producer, it ends to the consumer. And throughout that process, there are so many bureaucratic hurdles in Cuba. The entire distribution in the hands of Acopio is very inefficient. So many products might be actually wrought in some field because they never reach the farmers' markets. Others instead are never produced. The quota as a farmer you have to meet before you can actually bring your product to the farmers' market. There are so many things that the product you can or cannot produce and so forth. So there are so many obstacles that make that agricultural sector, which by the way, at some point it was 20% of the Cuban workforce was in agriculture. Now the number has been declining, but there is no doubt that is one of the lowest productivity sector of the entire Cuban economy. And finally, the relations with China. China is a different entity than Venezuela. It operates with different set of assumptions and expectations. So China, for instance, received nickel from Cuba, received other products. It does have several consumer goods exported to Cuba. It was involved in some foreign investment projects, but for the most part, the business relation with China is based on business imperative, not like Venezuela, that instead was at some point more of a friendly relationship that from a business standpoint might not make sense completely, but it was moving forward. China has been going up, increasing its ties with Cuba, decreasing depending on what the business imperatives are. So it's a very different relationship.
Thank you, Paolo. Do we have another set of questions? I might ask, Paolo, you said that some of the economic reform measures that were reissued that were based on longstanding reforms that have been present in Cuba for a while. How are cuentapropistas faring? Are they, how are they doing? And is the environment really conducive to them making a comeback or not?
So far, cuentapropista always have been a viable alternative to state activities. Now, the problem is that until now, as I said before, the government had a list of activities, and that list was so specific. You could sell, I don't know, you could be a clown in a public square, so you can work with tourists. You can do that. You can sell this particular product. You can provide this small service. Now the idea is to make, okay, this is what you cannot do and this is what you can do. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to the process of licenses. The government sometimes might release licenses, sometimes might make your life so impossible that you have to relinquish your license. And if there's not an actual change of mentality where the private and cooperative sector are given the right role in the economy, that can grow and can be a complement to state activities, it will always remain underrepresented. So the problem is the self-entrepreneurs, they've been relegated to non-essential activities, and they've been practically the very first one, the very first victim of the Trump's measure, of the economic problem the country is facing right now. Unfortunately, those are the very first one. And one thing that I want to mention is that non-agricultural cooperatives in 2011 were specifically stated that they were going to be allowed to grow in many different sectors. But for the most part, we are 10 years later, except in some transportation cooperatives and few minor activities, even then the cooperatives, not just the self-entrepreneurs, have been allowed to grow very little. And of course, now with the COVID-19, many licenses have to be relinquished, and it will take a while, even when the economy recovers, those activities to be at full speed.
We have a question from Ezra.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation. And I had a quick question about data. I know, of course, more data would be incredible from the Cuban government. You mentioned that they, for the first time in 2019, published more or disaggregated data on service. I was wondering if you could talk about, I don't know, any explanation for why that has, that seems like a significant change, and is there some kind of effort by the Cuban government to make the economy more, easier to measure and to analyze for themselves and for the international community?
I appreciate the question. For us, Cuba watchers and researchers for a long time, any new data, we take it, and it's a welcome development. When it comes to services, I don't really have a real reason why they decide to do it. Sometimes even a regular number like the number of Cuban Americans or Cubans traveling to Cuba never appeared in the visitors, international visitors. So sometimes there's just something happened and they decide to release the data. The good thing is that they did it in 2018, the very first time. In 2019, they did it again. So I hope that number will continue, because it gives an idea of a very big segment of the economy that until now remain in the dark. You had the exports of goods and the category of services. Even the category of service in the official thing, there's no breakdown of tourism versus other services. You had to go in a different chapter and you get the revenues of tourism. But even those are not fully inclusive, because what are the measures of the private sector in tourism? Are those included there? Apparently they are. How do you measure that? Many other countries, they do service, exit service of visitors. Before leaving airports, they have them filling out surveys so they can measure what they spend, where they spend. All of that in Cuba is still at the beginning, is not there. So let alone the services in general, even tourism revenues were kind of not very explanatory until now. So it's a welcome development, but definitely there needs to be way more when it comes to services. One thing that I want to add, Cuba has not updated the balance of payments. It's always outdated every year. So I mentioned the external debt, but even other indicators that in other countries are provided every year in the balance of payments, Cuba does not update them regularly. So you're always like 4 or 5 years behind schedule. That's what you're working with when you look at Cuban data. So it's a tough country to work on in terms of data, but it has to be acknowledged that they've become better over the past few years as compared to what they used to be only a few years ago.
We have a final question. It's in the chat, and my apologies if I mispronounced the name, Anirudh. Can't find the raise your hand option, but I can acknowledge you, and you can unmute yourself and pose a question yourself if you'd like.
I can see the.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so my question was, in the last 2 slides, we discussed the prospects as to what the Cuban government is doing in order to revive the economy. But assuming that you are an analyst, what measures, or you are part of the administration, what measures would you have taken to revive the economy?
Thank you for the question. Let's say, traditionally, many economists in Cuba and observers outside have been provided so many suggestions how to improve the economy. In my opinion, definitely market mechanisms should be playing a bigger role. So the idea of a centralized economy where you make most decisions at the central level, decentralization is there, but in real terms, when it comes to very important decisions being taken still centrally, it's a major impediment. But first and foremost, it's a change of mentality that is needed, both on the issue for investment and both on the issue of the private sector, what role should be played in the economy. So from my standpoint, it would be even good, all the things that they said they're going to do, if they actually do it, it already would make a significant effect in positive terms. So at the very least, to do what they said they're going to do. The problem is that things are announced, there's a big headlines, Cuba is willing to do this and that. I make an example, agriculture that we talked about before. The private sector, I mean, in agriculture, the wholesale market, the inputs for farmers, they've been announced, there've been several stores, but overall, still, they never put into practice. A few years ago in Havana, there was a very famous case of a wholesale market that just popped up naturally without the inspectors and anything. And then it was allowed to grow and everybody loved it. All of a sudden, they alleged that there was some irregularities, corruption practices, they shut it down. Private sector being able to export or import, why through state company? Why they cannot do it independently? So these are all things that, whether you want to do it or not, it all comes from a change of mentality. And one thing that I'm going to end with, the entire reform process that Raul Castro launched in 2006 stopped around 2012, 2013, when there was the big effort to reform the state enterprises of Cuba. Those are the most in need of reforms, the real autonomy, possibility to operate independently, to make decisions, to reinvert profits, to export, to import, all those kind of things. Only at the central level, if there's a real political will to do something like that, will come into practice and will make a difference. Until certain, let's say, mentality hurdles are not tackled effectively and are not changed, Cuba will still lag behind, will still face significant economic problems. So to me, at the very least, doing what they said they're going to do, it's already a big point of departure. Then, of course, you can do even more.
Well,
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
We are past our time. Would you please join me in thanking Paolo for his excellent presentation? And I'd like to also thank the Cuban and Caribbean Studies Institute for inviting me to moderate this session. And again, my congratulations for this excellent initiative. Thank you all very much, and we hope to see you at the next event. Carolina?
Right. Thank you very much, Paolo. Thank you, Ludovico, for hosting and moderating. That was wonderful. And I want to invite you all back. Our next talk in the series will be Professor Ted Henkin. He will, the title of his talk will be "Who Will Control Cuba's Digital Revolution?" That will be on February 25th, Thursday, again at the same time at 12:30. And if you check your chat right now, there is a link to the announcement on the Stone Center website. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.